Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Wilmette Institute's 10th Web Talk of 2015. These are Web Talks, of course, to celebrate our 20th anniversary, but since they're so successful, we will undoubtedly continue them in 2016. So if you have suggestions for people we should invite to speak next year, we would be really happy to hear about them. I should begin perhaps by giving a quick summary of the Wilmette Institute for people who are joining us for the first time. We were established in January of 1995 by a decision of the National Spiritual Assembly. And at first, we just ran face-to-face programs out of Wilmette because there were two colleges within walking distance of the temple where people could stay and where we could have classes, and then they could walk to the house of worship every day for devotions. It was really a marvelous combination. That lasted for a while, but starting in 1998, we also began online courses with the limited software that was available in those days for running online courses. So far, as of now, as of today, I compiled the latest statistics. We have 9,065 people who have taken our courses since 1998 online, and we've offered a total of 328 courses. Some of those, of course, are reruns. We've probably offered Islam for Deepening and Dialogue about 12 times, for example. We think 110 different countries where people have resided to take our courses, and those participants on our courses have been enriched. They've been able to give countless presentations to all kinds of different classes, deepening study classes. We have no idea how many people have become Baha'is. Not that many directly. We do have people who are interested in the faith taking our courses. Our latest calculation is 2.5%. Some of them declare, but also many people who are interested in the faith hear about the faith or hear more about the faith because the people who take our courses have more to say, have more confidence, and that has been perhaps one of the most rewarding aspects of running the Wilmette Institute. After running all these courses for pretty much 20 years, we decided to add Web Talks, which you're participating in today. We're also beginning to offer webinars, which are basically our courses but with a live video component. And we're working on web publications so that our students and our faculty, for that matter, have a place to publish PowerPoints and talks and even art projects from our courses so that they will enrich the lives of more people, and more people will, of course, be able to benefit from Wilmette Institute education this way. We're also working on ways where college students might be able to take some of our courses and then get credit through their local universities. So that's a very ambitious program that we have, and we're increasingly looking at ways to reach out to the community of interest, to seekers, and of course to Baha'i youth and their friends so that we can support their study of the faith as well. Today, we're very, very fortunate to have Sovaida Ewing speaking to us about World Federation and the challenges of creating, as some people say, a world government. She's an international lawyer, independent scholar, and founding director of the Center for Peace and Global Governance. And she has published a book, Building a World Federation, the Key to Solving Our Global Crises, which of course is the basis of our course that she's currently teaching through the Wilmette Institute. And I think that's also pretty much the topic of the talk today. She's also published Collective Security Within Reach by George Ronald in 2008, and she maintains a collective security blog, which you might want to visit. You can see the HTTP here as well. She's also published various other things, including with her mother, Baha'i Rohani Ma'ani, who was our speaker for our last web talk. And they've even been working on a book for helping Baha'i children. So that is my introduction to Sovaida.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, from the East Coast of the United States. Thank you all for joining me. It's a real pleasure to be here. The topic of today is Building a World Federation, the Key to Resolving Our Global Crises. All right, so it doesn't take much for us to know that our world is in crisis. Every time we turn the television on or look at the newspaper, we see that the world is in a complete mess. Whether it's climate change that we're being warned about, the dire situation of our world with the melting ice caps and glaciers that are going to lead to many islands disappearing, many coast coasts disappearing underwater. They're going to reduce the quantity of land that we can live on. We're going to have less food, less fresh water, less resources, and we're eventually going to be fighting over all of these resources according to all the studies that are done, whether we're talking about that, whether we're talking about nuclear proliferation and arms control, whether it's the global financial crisis or the flourishing of terrorist groups such as ISIL in the Middle East, or the migrant crisis, which is one of the greatest crises of our times. All we need to do, again, is to look at the newspaper and see the flow, really the tsunami of migrants flowing from the Middle East, in particular, towards Europe. We know that we are in for some very, very difficult times. One of the consequences of these crises is that our friends and family and colleagues are getting very depressed. I know that when I talk to my colleagues, they shake their heads and say, this is unprecedented, we don't know what to do, and we just don't have any hope. The problem with the lack of hope and depression is that it leads to paralysis. And paralysis is exactly the one thing we cannot afford to suffer from right now, because it's a time for action. It's a time for us to turn back this tide of crises, to find constructive and creative solutions. It's time for us to consult together. As the Universal House of Justice said in its peace statement of 1985, it's time for the leaders of the world and the peoples to exercise an act of consultative will in order to address these problems. This is definitely not the time for us to give up. So hopefully this presentation today will imbue us with a certain amount of understanding, perspective, and therefore hope in order for us to be able to arise and take action and encourage our friends to do the same. Now, one of the wonderful understandings that the writings of the Baha'i Faith give us that I find very helpful in starting this process of encouragement is understanding why we are where we are and what the future brings and where we are in the scope of history. We are told by the Baha'i writings that if humanity is to be likened to a human being going through various stages of development, the collective whole, i.e. humanity, is now in the throes of a very turbulent adolescence. We've come through our stages of infanthood and toddlerhood and childhood, and we've passed the junior youth stage, and we're now standing at that really critical stage, probably 17 and 18-year-old stage, where we're pushing the envelope, we're experimenting with really dangerous behavior. But the good news is that we stand at the threshold of maturity. Now, the reason I find this metaphor really, really helpful is that I know from my own personal life and looking around me that the teenage years can be very difficult years. However, parents don't chuck their teenagers out as soon as they get difficult. And the main reason they don't do that is they have perspective. They know and understand that this is simply a phase and that this phase will pass. The question does remain how quickly this phase will pass. Some teenagers seem to prolong the teenage years and act out more and engage in increasingly dangerous behaviors and self-destructive behaviors, and others seem to go through it in a smoother fashion. And this is where human free will kicks in, at the individual and at the collective level. To the extent that we begin to make good choices, good collective choices, we can hasten our movement through this period of adolescence and attain the stage of maturity faster. To the extent, however, that we choose to get locked into old patterns of behavior that suited the previous developmental stages out of which we are now growing, and insist on self-destructive behaviors, then we're definitely going to prolong this process. And unfortunately, the consequence of prolonging this process is going to be increased, prolonged, and intensified suffering. So we have some critical choices to make. The good news, however, as I said, is that this metaphor provides us with a certain amount of hope. Hope that if we take action, if we're creative, and if we consult and come up with constructive solutions, we can get to the stage of our collective maturity faster. So it's time to move on. It's time to move on to what? It's time for humanity to move on to a stage of deeper integration. One of the overarching, actually the overarching movement we see throughout the history of humanity, despite our wars and despite our conflicts and despite our bad behavior, is this gradual but very perceptible and clear overarching move towards increased integration that will eventually bring peace to the world. The Baha'i writings negate the idea that humans are essentially bad by nature and explain them through this metaphor that we've just discussed. So it's time now to very consciously take the next step towards achieving a deeper integration. Why is this next stage so timely? I must remember to use my slides. All right. Sorry about this. The timeliness of the next step is indicated by two things. For the first time in the history of humanity, we live in a period of interconnectedness and interdependence. The whole world is really so inextricably interwoven with itself and all the parts of it with each other, that we have become, as Baha'u'llah says, like members of a single human body. The kidneys can no longer say to the liver, we don't really care about your destiny. We don't care whether you're ailing. The heart can no longer say to the lungs, well, gosh, it's your problem. Leave me alone. I don't want to have anything to do with your suffering or disease. We're so inextricably interwoven that we have to act collectively. The other really interesting thing, an unprecedented phenomenon, is that most or many of the problems that we experience today are collective in nature. We named a few: global warming, the global financial crisis, the proliferation of all kinds of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, trafficking in women and children, the migrant crisis, pandemics, the danger of pandemics like the Ebola virus. These are all global crises. And because they're global, they demand global solutions. So it's clear that the time is now for us to take the next step. What exactly is the next step? The next step is for us to start building a United States of the world, basically a global world federation or a world government. These are different ways of describing the same state towards which we're moving. This was a piece of advice that the son of the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith, Abdul-Baha, gave when he traveled to the West, to the United States in 1912. A high official of the US government had approached him and said, I really want to serve my country and humanity. Can you advise me on the best way in which I can do this? Interestingly, of all the things that Abdul-Baha could have told this gentleman, the thing he said was, if you want to best serve your country and humanity, then engage in exporting the principles of federalism that underlie your system of government to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world really needs this. In the 1930s, the second authorized interpreter of the Baha'i writings, Shoghi Effendi, said that the creation of a world superstate was imminent. That was his word, imminent, and I've always found that really interesting. The reason I find it interesting is that we seem to be behind the times in achieving it. We're now about 90 years past the time when he made that comment, and we're still clearly struggling. And I often wonder if the reason for the suffering and the struggles we're going through is not exactly that we're behind the curve in our societal evolution and development. So what will it take for us to be convinced that we need to take the next step? What it will take, sorry. What it's going to take is, unfortunately, a lot of intense suffering, both mental and physical. Again, Shori Effendi says that if we look at history, we will see that we have achieved great things only after suffering intense mental and physical agony. He observes that this seems to be the way that the human race learns its lessons and takes the next step towards its maturity. We have seen this in the context of America. If we look at the American experience, how it moved from being a confederation of 13 loosely associated states to a federation, it basically took a very bloody civil war to get America to understand that it needed to move towards the next step of cohesion and integration. If we look at the experiment that we're still currently experiencing in Europe in the form of the European Union, which is very slowly and painfully moving towards a federation, again, we will see that that has come about as a result of a lot of suffering. And the first step, in fact, with the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community was only taken in the aftermath of a very bloody Second World War that decimated the countries of Western Europe, that took that step towards creating what has now become the European Union. The second thing it's going to take, I believe, to get us to move towards further integration on a global level is becoming convinced of a very important principle that has been articulated in the Baha'i writings. In my view, this is one of the most revolutionary foundational principles that Baha'u'llah has brought. And that is the understanding that the only way to guarantee the interest of the part, and in this sense we're talking about the nation, for instance, the only way for a nation to guarantee its own self-interest is by ensuring and guaranteeing the interest of the whole, i.e. all the nations of the world, i.e. humanity. So until these two things happen, we will not be able to take the next step. And then the question is very concretely now we're getting to the concrete part of this presentation, what exactly is it we need to do? In order to start building a world federation, which we said is the answer proposed in the Baha'i writings to these collective problems that we have, because we need collective solutions, and is based on the advice given by Abdu'l-Baha in 1912, in order to take that advice, there are three things that I believe we need to do. And this is what I understand from reading the Baha'i writings. The first is to follow the blueprint or the design given to us in the Baha'i writings. Whenever we're going to undertake a building project, basically one requires three things. The first is to have a blueprint from an architect who is experienced and creative and knows what he or she is doing. Here the divine architect is Baha'u'llah, who has given us the blueprint or design. The second thing we need when building is tools and materials. And the third thing is experience, looking at successful past models or looking to experienced builders to understand what pitfalls we need to avoid and what modes of operationalizing the building are ones that we really need to follow. Starting now with the blueprint, Baha'u'llah in his writings has basically given us a very basic framework of what a world federation or world government should encompass or look like. There are three very fundamental institutions, with a fourth that I will share with you shortly, that go to make up this world federation. As you see on the slide, the first is a world parliament, The second is a world executive, which is to be backed by an international standing army. That is the other institution that we will discuss briefly. And the third is a world court. Let's start with the first one, a world parliament. Now, we started off by saying that we live in a very interdependent and interconnected world in which many of our problems are global and therefore demand global solutions. The irony is that in this day and age, with this requirement and need, we're lacking in collective decision-making institutions. This is the role that the World Parliament is to play within Baha'u'llah's scheme. It is to be the collective decision-making institutions that will have the authority to make laws for the whole world, for the international community. Now, this World Parliament will not legislate in all spheres of activity. It will confine its legislation to those areas in which we have collective common needs. In my mind, when I think about climate change or global warming, that is an obvious area in which a world parliament would legislate, make environmental laws, for example, that tell us these are the kinds of energy that you can burn and in what quantity. We know from scientists today that burning fossil fuels has led us to this point of disaster, and that continuing to burn fossil fuels will continue to exacerbate global warming. And we're told that we need to drastically cut back on burning fossil fuels. However, at the moment, the system is such that nations can talk to each other, they can consult, they can volunteer to cut back emissions to a certain extent, but nobody can force them to do so. And there is no international body or agency that can make a binding rule that forces every nation to burn only a certain amount of fossil fuels. We also don't have an international agency that does collaborative research and development on finding alternative sources of clean energy. So this is one area in which I see a future world parliament making collective decisions that serve our common good. Another example that comes to mind is the global financial crisis. We know from all the analysis that's been done within Europe especially that the Europeans are concluding that at least at the European level they need to have a unified system of setting budgets so that nations, before they set budgets on how much income they'll raise and how much, more importantly, they will spend, all the other nations of Europe will also have a say, so that one nation doesn't overspend, get itself into a situation as Greece did, where it overspent by a lot, which it accumulated large amounts of sovereign debt and was then unable to pay that debt off, and then had to look to the other nations of Europe to bail it out, not once, not twice, but several times over. So again, this is an area in which I envision in the future a world parliament would be in a situation at the global level to set certain financial regulations, for instance, to ensure that banks don't engage in risky activity that would allow themselves or nations to go bankrupt, that nations not be allowed to overspend way beyond their means and budget, putting them in crisis and causing them to have to ask for bailout funds. Which leads us to the second authority or power that the World Parliament would have as envisioned in the Baha'i writings, and that is the power to impose a certain amount of taxation. Now, this is a really interesting component that the world is starting to understand very slowly and painfully. We, again, looking at the financial crisis, the global financial crisis and the European financial crisis, we saw that, as we said, some of the countries in Europe needed to be rescued by other countries. They required bailout funds. The wealthy countries that provided the bailout funds were unhappy after a while and continue to be so, saying, wait a minute, it's not fair that you guys can keep overspending and we have to keep bailing you out. And so one of the things that has been broached, a topic that has been raised, in fact, the Chancellor of Germany had recommended this. It hasn't come to pass yet, but I believe it will, is that Europe should be allowed, the European Union should be allowed to tax individuals, members of the European Union countries, so that they have a fund available, a bailout fund in which everybody is vested. People of all nations are vested, so that when one country gets into trouble, it's not just the wealthier countries or the countries that have been doing well who get to bail them out, but the money comes from this common pool in which everybody has been contributing over time. Now, very interestingly, going back to what Abdu'l-Baha said about America and applying the principles of federalism that underlay the system of government, one of the interesting things to me is that when we look at the history of America, one of the things that pushed this group of 13 Confederate states to become a federation was precisely a debt crisis, if you like, a sovereign debt crisis. The 13 Confederate states had, during the Revolutionary War, each amassed large amounts of debt. They had borrowed money from foreign powers, European powers. After the war, they found themselves unable to repay their debts, and they started printing paper money. Money started to lose its value. The Confederate Congress was unable to do anything. Its coffers were empty because it had no power to tax. And the danger was that this confederation was going to fall apart completely. And they realized that there was one of two alternative roads to take. One was to see the disintegration of the 13 states, or to move towards further integration, move towards a federation, create a strong centralized Congress, give it the power of taxation, create central funds, and then pool all the debts of the 13 states into Congress's hands and allow Congress to repay the debts. And that is exactly what happened. And this is how we ended up with the United States of America. It was one of the driving forces. It's one of those elements of our history that I know I had forgotten, and I think many of us have, but it's very interesting. Another interesting fact that I'll share with you is that in 2011, when the European officials of central banks came to consult with officials at the U.S. Treasury about ways to help them get out of the financial crisis, what the American officials did was they gave them a set of the Articles of Confederation and then a set of the Articles of Federation and a copy of our current Constitution in the United States, and said, hey guys, take this home, study this. There's a reason we moved from being a confederation to federation. You guys are essentially a confederation, and it's time for you to seriously consider moving on and achieving deeper integration and creating a United States of Europe. This was Abdu'l-Baha's advice being exported almost 100 years later. It was actually 99 years later from the time he gave the advice. Again, this is a fact that I find very, very interesting. All right, moving on. The third power that this World Parliament would have would be the power to manage critical global natural resources and to ensure that they're equitably made available and distributed to all those who need them around the world. When we think, for instance, of sources of energy, today oil and gas, although we need to stop burning them, they're still very much sought after sources of energy, or nuclear energy. If we think about even food and water, critical resources that are going to dwindle in quantity, the warnings are already with us. The scientists have told us that as climate change gets worse, we're going to have less food and less clean water for all peoples around the world. So we're going to need a collective decision-making body that represents all the peoples of the world, in which all have a voice and say, that can make decisions on behalf of the collective whole rather than of the part. So this is another power that within the Baha'i vision, the World Parliament would have. And the fourth most critical power it would have would be the power to make war. In other words, all the nations of the world would have to cede or give up their right to make war, give it up to this central institution in which they have a hand and voice in electing and which represents everybody, all nations and peoples fairly, and say, we give up this right to make war. And this centralized institution would have standing behind it an international standing army, so that if any nation of the world arose to disturb the peace of the world, all the nations as a collective whole, as represented by this international institution, would stand up in the face basically of the bully on the playground and say, look, no you don't. We're not going to let you destroy the peace of the world. So these are the four, what I view as the most critical powers that would vest within a collective decision-making parliament as envisioned in the Baha'i writings. The next key institution that we see discussed in the Baha'i writings is the world executive. Its key roles are to enforce the laws that a world parliament would create, binding laws, and it would also enforce judgments of a world court. Now we're going to get to the world court and what it does in the next slide, so I'd like you to sort of hold this in your mind, that in order for a court that arbitrates disputes between countries, for its decisions to be enforceable, the body that will be tasked with enforcing them is this world executive. And it will do it with the help of an international standing army. Now, the International Standing Army is a very critical body within this scheme. When we look at the world today, we see that we have a United Nations. People often think that the United Nations is a world government. Let's be very clear. The United Nations, although a wonderful organization that has done wonderful things, is not a world government. For one, it lacks a collective decision-making institution. The UN General Assembly is a body, a consultative body. However, it lacks the power and authority to create binding legislation that all nations must follow. It's a wonderful place for leaders to get together on a regular basis to build trust, to consult on things, but at the end of the day, all they can do is pass resolutions that basically have the virtue of encouraging, urging countries to follow a certain path of action, but cannot require them to act in a certain way and are not binding on them. We also have a Security Council that has been tasked with the job of maintaining peace and security in the world. Now, all we need to do is to look at the state of our world today to recognize that it hasn't been as successful as the framers of the United Nations Charter hoped it would be. It hasn't been successful for two very critical reasons. One is the veto power, which we see resident in the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And we will come to that a little bit later. It doesn't make sense in this day and age for any one country on the face of this planet to be able to veto what another 192 or 93 nations believe is in the best interests of the world when it comes to maintaining peace and security. But beyond that, even if the members of the Security Council are united behind a course of action, again, all they can do is pass resolutions. Unfortunately, what they don't have is an international standing force that can execute their decisions. We do have peacekeeping forces, but they consist of volunteer forces that various nations of the earth offer to the Security Council as they are able and willing to do. And they're cobbled together in piecemeal fashion to deal with crises. The other problem with this whole scheme that we currently have is that these peacekeeping forces are exactly that. They have the authority to keep the peace but not to enforce the peace. In other words, they can act as a buffer between two sides, but they can't take proactive action, go in and basically bring a genocidal leader to heel, or get rid of militias that are overrunning a certain country. They can go in only at the invitation, generally, of countries. So if the country does not invite them, let's say in a country in which genocide is happening, they tend not to invite peacekeeping forces to come in because they don't want any outside interference, because they want to be able to continue with their genocide. And once they're there, they are there literally just to hold the two sides at arm's length, but don't have the power to take corrective action. So this is where, again, the vision in the Baha'i writings is so forward-looking and unique and necessary. By the way, one of the benefits of having a standing army is this, that it will be a deterrent force. I firmly believe that in a world in which we had an international standing army, a lot of problems would never even come about. I think a lot of, for instance, the secret nuclear weapons programs that we've seen in different parts of the world would never have begun if countries knew that we had a robust international executive backed by an international army that represented all the peoples of the earth, in which the forces of all nations participated, in which the decision to act vested in an institution in which all the countries of the world partook, and in which the conditions for that force to engage were pre-decided by all the international community, including their country. So I think we could forestall a lot of the problems that we see in the world, ranging from gross human rights atrocities, use of chemical weapons against the peoples of a country, the engagement in genocide, nuclear proliferation, human trafficking in women and children, terrorism, a lot of problems I think would either not exist or abate significantly if we had such an institution. Another benefit of an international standing army is that it would maintain the credibility of the international institutions that at the moment pass resolution after resolution with no effect and thereby lose their credibility. If we go back to to Iraq, when it had a secret nuclear weapons program, over 12 years, the Security Council passed resolution after resolution urging the government of Iraq to desist, to no avail. And in the end, we had to go in, there was a coalition of forces, and had to go in and ensure that the nuclear weapons, the secret weapons program that had been created against international law was no longer there. Other benefits, by the way, of the International Standing Army is that the international community will be able to step into problem areas in the world and act quickly and decisively before problems fester and get big. The financial burden of such military action will be shared. It won't be any one country shouldering financial responsibility, which we're discovering no one nation wants to do anymore, because it is expensive. And the final benefit is that laws will be applied even-handedly, and this is a benefit that is not to be underestimated. The even-handed application of international law is one of the critical areas that needs attention in the world. At the moment, we have a situation where laws are not applied even-handedly. Some countries break the rules on nuclear proliferation, and other countries look the other way because they trust them or they're their allies. Whereas other countries will break the same rules and sanctions will be imposed on them. The unfortunate result of this kind of uneven application is that it gives excuses into the hands of countries that want to misbehave to say, hey, look, you're not really interested in applying the law. You're just interested in persecuting us because you don't like us because of our religion or because you want access to our energy resources. And they get to play members of the international community, i.e. different nations, off against each other. And in the long run, they get to get away with destructive behavior. All right, now we can move on to this next slide, which is the third critical institution as envisioned in the Baha'i writings, and that is a world court. It will have certain key powers. What will the role of a world court be? So the role of the world court is to mediate disputes between nations in order to avoid war. Now, one of the things that the world court cannot do right now is that it does not have compulsory jurisdiction to force nations when they have disputes between them to come before it. We have a very odd system in which nations can opt out of showing up before the world court. When I work with young people, I tell them, can you imagine a society in which we have laws about murder, somebody commits murder, and then is asked, would you like to show up in court and be tried, or would you like to sit this one out and opt out? And it's obvious what the answer is. They laugh, they think it's funny, but this is exactly the kind of institution and system that we have at the international level. It's child's play, basically. And given that the world is now so interdependent and interconnected, and that we need to solve these global problems, and we need to stop resorting to war and conflict, it's time that we fix this critical flaw in our system and create a world court in which the court has compulsory jurisdiction, even if nations don't want to show up in court when they're in conflict with each other. They're going to have to in order to resolve their disputes. So that's one of the features of Baha'u'llah's vision of a new kind of world court that again is new and unique and critical to this stage of maturity of the human race. The second element of this world court is that its judgments need to be binding and enforceable. Again, if we look at the world court we have today, believe it or not, when the court passes judgment, it relies on the goodwill of nations to abide by its judgments. In fact, there is verbiage in the statute of the International Court that essentially says that we rely on the honor system for nations to go ahead once we have adjudicated a case between them and we have passed judgment. We trust them to go ahead and enforce our judgments. Again, that would be like saying to the murderer who has now shown up for trial and in which the judge has given a verdict, and say to the murderer, well, this is the honor system now. Here are the keys to the jailhouse. Please walk yourself over, let yourself in, lock yourself in, and stay there for the next 20 years or 30 years of your life. Obviously, that's not going to work. If nations have misbehaved in the first place, we cannot trust them to then voluntarily abide by and enforce the judgments of the World Court. And in fact, and indeed, experience has demonstrated that that's true. So we don't have to engage in conjecture on this issue. All right, so we've now talked about the first of the three steps that we need to do to take when we're building anything, and that was to follow a blueprint or design. And what I just finished sharing with you were the outlines of the blueprint as designed by Baha'u'llah, the divine architect. The next thing we need are tools to build, with which to build. The tools are what I call foundational principles. These foundational principles are ones that can be gleaned again from the Baha'i writings. What we need to do is to, first of all, identify what these foundational principles of a new system of international relations are. We then need to all agree on them, achieve consensus around them worldwide, and having done so, apply them without compromise. Now, what are some of these foundational principles? The first really important one that we've already talked about is understanding that the advantage of the part can best be achieved by assuring the advantage of the whole. So we won't belabor that point. This principle, though, emanates from a more foundational principle, and that is the principle of the oneness of peoples and nations. The guardian of the Baha'i Faith, the second authorized interpreter of the Baha'i teachings, says something very interesting in his World Order letters. He says that the principle of oneness really has more to do with the relationship between institutions and nations than it does between individuals. I find that really fascinating. In a world in which we're so interconnected, and in which these problems are so critical, this is one of the beauties of the Baha'i Faith, is that it really speaks to the needs of our time. The Baha'i Faith isn't just about individual salvation, about me saving my soul, about me preparing myself for the next world, for the afterlife, but it's also about taking humanity to the next step of its societal evolution. Really the final and culminating stage in social organization, according to the writings of the Guardian. And it will rest on a deep understanding of the principle of peoples, principle of the oneness of peoples and nations. Once this principle is understood, the Guardian says it has to become the operational principle in international life. A little earlier on, I talked about the veto power at the Security Council. To me, that's a good example of operationalizing the principle of oneness. Let's imagine that we could start building a new set of institutions to deal with our problems today. So a new executive. Could we possibly, given that we are going to have to weave in the principle of oneness into the institution and rest the institution on the premise of oneness, is it conceivable that we could have a world executive in which any nation has veto power? And the answer is absolutely not. It's impossible to say to nations, we love and respect you, we believe we're one, but we're so sorry in this instance, even though all the nations of the world agree that this course of action would be good for the peace of the world, we, this country, believe that it is in our self-interest to say no and exercise a power of veto. That is really impossible if you are to build a system based on the premise of the oneness of humanity. Another critical principle articulated in the Baha'i writings is that it's time for nations to cede a certain amount of their sovereignty to global institutions that represent us all. The days of unfettered national sovereignty are over. And the good news is that all nations of the world actually do understand this. And I'll explain a little bit more about why I say this later in the presentation. Another very advanced principle that Baha'u'llah has brought is the principle of collective security. And basically, this is what it says. It says that all the nations of the world have to come together and enter into an agreement that says that the amount of arms that each of them have will be limited to the amount that's necessary for each of them to preserve order within their borders. Any amount of arms beyond that, they will have to destroy, clearly under some form of international supervision, because again, we can't leave it to nations to do this voluntarily. Having done that, they also need to agree that if one nation arises to breach the peace of the world, all the nations will stand up against that nation and bring it to heel. Using what tool? The International Standing Army that was part of the blueprint that we talked about. Another very advanced principle is the principle that force is to be used as a servant of justice. The reason I raise this is that some people misunderstand Baha'u'llah's system and believe that the Baha'is believe that we are now at the point in our societal evolution in which we can stop using force altogether. Unfortunately, this is not true. Although we're told that we as nations are no longer to use force in our international relations with each other, international bodies still have the authority to use force when necessary in accordance with predetermined rules that are established by everyone collectively. In other words, it's not one nation or a group of nations that gets to decide what the rules are, when force is going to be used. And force cannot be used unilaterally or in coalitions of governments or nations. It is to be used only by the international institution, namely the World Parliament, through the World Executive, using the tool of the International Standing Army, and in service of justice, i.e. to maintain peace and security around the world. In addition to these foundational principles, the Baha'i writings tell us that there are other really critical conditions that must exist for this system of world governance to be successful. One of the conditions is that unity of nations must be created in an environment of diversity, the preservation of diverse traditions, cultures, languages, music, etc. This is very critical. The Baha'i writings do not advocate unity and uniformity. That is anathema. And many of us are familiar with the beautiful metaphor that Abdu'l-Baha gives of the garden that would be so boring if it consisted only of one kind of flower, one color, one height, one fragrance. The beauty of the garden, and he says the perfection of the human race, consists in its diversity. That is the hallmark, he says, of the perfection of humanity. And so we need to not only tolerate it, but celebrate and encourage it. This is a key point. The second condition that must exist is the encouragement of a sane and intelligent patriotism. Again, the Baha'i writings do not advocate that we eliminate nations altogether. We're not at that stage in our evolution, and I don't know that we ever will be. Nation states are to continue to exist as federal units of a world federation. This assures that each nation is responsible to its own people, that there's accountability, that the needs of a particular region or nation can be dealt with at that level by people who really understand and are closer to the needs and the aspirations of their people. And it also ensures diversity, and it encourages the members, the citizens of each nation, to vie with citizens of other nations in advancing the sciences, in creating beautiful music, and creating beautiful arts. In other words, a healthy sort of vying and patriotism, as opposed to a destructive competition which says the interests of my country at any expense, even if it means that I have to tread over the interests of other countries. Another critical condition for this kind of vision of global governance to succeed is the avoidance of excessive centralization. Again, by ensuring that we have nation states and that they retain a certain amount of powers and authority, we ensure that a whole lot of decision making still rests at the national level and at the regional and at the local level. Only a certain amount of decisions are made at the international level by these global institutions, and those are, again, to repeat, in the areas of common interest and common problem. Things like climate change, where no one country can solve the problem on its own, and it requires international collaboration and consultation and action, collective action, in order to solve them. Now, the third thing we said in building a world federation that we need to look at is learning from past experience. So first we have the blueprint and design that we examined. The next thing that we looked at was the tools. The third thing is to look at past experience. The American experience is really a fascinating one from which we can learn. Again, I'd like to be very clear about something. The Baha'i writings do not say that the American system of government as it is a model to be followed. Abdu'l-Baha was very precise in what he said. He said it's the principles of federalism underlying the system of government that need to be exported. So we're looking at the principles of federalism, and these principles have been applied in other parts of the world as well, and are in the process of gradually being applied in Europe as well as the European Union evolves. One of the interesting things we learn from both experiences, the American and the European, is that suffering seems to be necessary. The other is that skepticism can be overcome. Before America moved towards a federation, the people of the 3 Confederate states said never, this can never happen, we're too different, we do things very differently, we can never be united and integrated under one. There are all these problems. Whatever arguments people today craft against the idea of a world federation, these arguments came up with respect to the move towards an American federation, and were dealt with, by the way, very deftly in the Federalist Papers. It's a very interesting set of documents. One of the arguments was exactly this about a standing army. It made people very skittish, and yet the danger that the American Confederate States experienced was that different states had armies. And the fear was that different states would align themselves with different foreign powers. And as those foreign powers, say France and Germany, went to war with each other, states within the Confederation might go to war against each other. So you could get a situation in which Virginia and Maryland, for instance, were at war with each other because they had aligned themselves with different foreign powers. And this was a threat to the well-being and the unity of the American system. The same thing holds true at the international level. Each country has its own standing army, but these standing armies are now threatening the peace of the world. Especially with what's going on with Syria, we now see, somebody had written an article in the New York Times the other day saying that we now see a proto-world war developing in Syria, where different nations are being pulled into a fight that started off as an internal fight and ended up as a civil war, and now different countries around the world, including major powers, are getting involved, and this could potentially escalate and become a world war of sorts. So this is exactly the kind of situation that the scheme advocated by Baha'u'llah can help us avoid. Now, many people are going to be very skeptical and say, this whole vision that you are putting forward and which the Baha'i writings propose are impossible of fulfillment. For one, we're never going to be able to create the infrastructure in the form of a world parliament, world executive, and world court. And secondly, we're never going to get nations of the world to agree upon principles. In response to both, we need to understand and know that both are not only possible, but we know they're possible because they have been done. The argument for the possibility of creating a federal world structure is exactly the experience of the United States of America and the European experiment. In the aftermath of the Second World War, nations thought it was impossible to get together and pool their resources, namely coal and steel that they needed for rebuilding, in order to build up their decimated economies. And yet, because of the vision of a very forward-looking man, Jean Monnet, 6 European nations were willing to come together, pool their coal and steel in the hands of a supranational, i.e. sitting above nations institution that had the authority to oversee production of coal and steel, to ensure that it was distributed equally, to impose a quota system where necessary, and to ensure parity and equality of treatment between all nations. And this system worked for the whole 50 years that it was intended to work, and finally ended in 2002. So this is a fascinating study and an example of how creating this kind of structure in the face of skepticism and suspicion is possible. As to the question of whether it's possible to agree upon principles, the example that I would commend to your consideration is that of R2P, you'll see on this slide. It stands for Responsibility to Protect. This is a relatively new norm in international relations. It came into being, in other words, consensus was achieved around it only 10 years ago in 2005 at the Summit of World Leaders in New York City. You'll remember that we were all very excited about the leaders of the world coming together to make decisions about how they were going to relate to each other in the new millennium. They met in New York City in 2005, and interestingly, the only thing that all 193 nations at the time were able to agree, completely agree unanimously, was that there was a new norm in international relations called responsibility to protect. Let me tell you just a little bit about it. A few years prior to that, 5 years before that, the government of Canada had established a commission to examine the concept of sovereignty. What they were worried about was that in some countries, leaders were either unable or unwilling to protect their populations, particularly against genocide. And so they wanted to come up with a solution to this problem. What happens when you have a genocidal leader who is out to decimate a group within his or her country? What can the international community do about it? In short, they did several things. This commission, first of all, reframed the question and said the word sovereignty will no longer mean the right to do anything. It's not about your right as a nation to have others not intervene in your internal affairs. What it's really about is your responsibility to protect your people and take care of them. This group of people went round the world and interviewed every single leader, every single head of government and many cabinet members, and asked them and said, don't you believe that you have the responsibility to protect your people? They said yes. They said, well, what happens if you fail in this responsibility, either because you're unwilling or because you're unable? Don't your people deserve protection? And they said yes. They said, well, then who should step in and protect your people if you can't or won't? Clearly, you won't trust your neighbors to do it. Don't you think then that the international community should do it? And everybody unanimously said yes. And this became enshrined in this new principle of responsibility to protect that basically says when a nation can no longer or will no longer protect its own people, the international community has the responsibility to step in and take over and protect those people. Now, this was the first step, the consensus. Does it mean that we're now living in a perfect land? No, but at least we've achieved consensus around a principle that will now take years and decades to unfold in practice. But it does answer the question, is it possible for 193 or 94 nations of the world to come together and to achieve consensus around a set of foundational principles? And the answer is absolutely yes. And even better, it can be done in a very short period of time in the scheme of history. 5 years is not a very long time from conceiving of what this principle should be to actually getting international consensus around it. I am wrapping up here. Time is of the essence. Our world is in a critical state. It's in a critical state because of all the problems we articulated, but is in a critical state also because the solutions that we seem to be reaching for are leading us towards greater fragmentation. People of the world are not happy with the way that their governments are tackling all these major global problems. And so what they're trying to do now is to break off and create smaller and smaller units in which they can make decisions about their own destiny, in which they can have a greater say. They believe that they can be in control more if they fragment and break off, and that they can shield themselves from these global problems. Unfortunately, this trend is leading to more conflict, more strife, and it fails to take into account the reality that whether we like it or not, we do live in a very interconnected, interrelated world in which the problem of the part is the problem of the whole, and the problem of the whole is the problem of the heart. There is no other solution but to integrate and to craft global decision-making institutions that will solve our global collective problems. I am going to end my talk here and leave time, hopefully, for a few questions and answers. If you're interested in having further conversations, also feel free to get in touch with me through the website that is on this slide, cpgg.org, Center for Peace and Global Governance. And I would love to collaborate with you on projects to advance the cause of peace or to continue the discussion. Thank you very much for your time and attention. All right, Rob, on to you.
Thank you so much, Sovaida. This is really fascinating. I wish I could take your course, actually, because it's covering a lot more material than I imagined, and there's also a lot more detail, not only in the Baha'i writings, but in the material that you have for us that I ever imagined was available. So I really thank you for providing us with this fascinating set of a background on the subject. Let me pop up the questions here, and I'll turn my camera off after I give you the first one. There's quite a few questions that we have already, which is good to see.
Good.
I can hear myself whispering in the background, so we've got some feedback somewhere, I'm afraid. Someone asked whether they can get copies of the slides and the presentation, and I should add that we will have this recording available on our YouTube site within 6 to 36 hours, I think is what I'm meaning to say. And we will have the slides up also with Sovaida's permission. And we'll also have, thank you, and we'll also have an article in our e-newsletter that we'll put up on our on the web page as well, which will summarize the talk. So you'll have several possibilities there for seeing it again or getting the information from the presentation. Rodney asks, haven't the rights of making war been with the executive in the past for other countries?
I'm sorry. I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, he just says, isn't the right to make war with the executive in the past? I think the answer to that is that usually the legislature has to pass a declaration of war in many cases. Certainly kings had that right. I'm looking down here and see if there's another question. Would the world executive be a president or a body of people, do you think? There's a question for you.
The World Tribunal, sorry, or the World Parliament?
The World Executive, perhaps he has the Yugoslav model in mind, where you have several individuals who form a collective executive.
The World Executive, so the details of exactly how this is going to unfold are details that we don't know. We just know that it needs to be a body with the kinds of authorities described in the Baha'i writings. It is going to be, from my personal understanding of the writings, it is going to be up to the leaders of the world examining the different models that have worked and haven't worked to decide exactly what shape or form a world executive will take, as long as it has the powers that have been articulated in the Baha'i writings, and as long as they're effective. And you know, the nations may try one way and then it may evolve into a different way. There are also going to be different stages of world government, according to my understanding. At the time of the lesser or greater peace, which is the time in which we're in, and we're told by the Universal House of Justice that it is a process, it will be the leaders of nations who come together and recognize the need for a world federation or world government, and they will be the ones who make the decisions of exactly how this government will function. In the long distant future, in a future in which we have more Baha'is in the world and the time of the most great peace, we will have an evolution, if you like, of this world government. And at that point, it will come together and merge with the Baha'i administrative institutions. Again, exactly how that will happen, exactly what the interrelationship is between these two separate hierarchical sets of bodies and administrative structures is something that we're told not to speculate about. We don't know right now. It is something that will evolve in the future. So this is the best I can do in answering.
Rodney also asks, do you think the Baha'is can see the United Nations as a first step towards the World Parliament or the World Executive?
Yes, as I mentioned before, the United Nations has been a wonderful first step. In fact, it's been a second step. The League of Nations was actually the first step and failed for a number of reasons. We learned a number of things from the League of Nations and its failure and its successes. The United Nations was a second attempt. But we need to go a lot further. As I said before, the United Nations does not have the power to pass binding legislation. That is something we need today. It does not have the power to enforce that legislation. It's a power we need today. The World Court, which is an agency of the United Nations, does not have the powers that we discuss, compulsory jurisdiction and the ability to enforce its judgments and so on. Again, these are powers we need today. So we've learned a lot about what we need and don't have. We've learned a lot about what also works and what the United Nations does do well that it can continue to do in many realms, education, literacy, health, and so on, although improvements are needed on that front. But let me get to the bottom line of this question, which is a related question that's often asked, is that can the United Nations evolve into a world government? And frankly, the answer to that is it's going to depend very much on whether the United Nations is able to rise to the occasion and reform itself quickly enough and deeply enough in order to address some of our critical global problems. To the extent that it can, it will continue to be relevant. To the extent that it cannot, as The Guardian says, institutions, policies, laws are there to serve human happiness, not for us to be sacrificed to their continuation. So if the United Nations can evolve to meet our global societal needs, if it can address global warming, if it can address the proliferation of arms, if it can address terrorism and human trafficking, women and children, and the migrant crisis, and so on and so forth, and the global financial crisis, then yes. If it can't, I don't see that the world is going to have much patience, and probably shouldn't, and it may be time to start developing a new set of institutions, perhaps from scratch. The third alternative is to have these two, the United Nations continue while we also develop another set of institutions in tandem, and then eventually have them merge at some point, or eventually have the UN fade out, or have the UN focus on particular areas of endeavor while these other institutions take over. These are some things that I have discussed. I have some proposals and ideas of how we might go about this. This is just purely a personal opinion inspired by the Baha'i writings, but you can read about it in Collective Security Within Reach. And these are some very interesting questions.
I've often wondered whether the European Union hasn't become a kind of model that a Latin American Union, an African Union, other unions would emerge, and then possibly they would all grow in size to the point where they would decide to merge together. And so that's another sort of model, I think.
Yes, yeah.
Please.
No, I agree wholeheartedly, and in fact, this is the model that I advocated in Collective Security Within Reach as probably being the most likely model and the most politically palatable model for each region of the world to evolve and develop. And I've also made concrete suggestions about how they might go about this based on our past experience with the European Union and frankly with the African Union as well. So there's certain stages, and you basically start by creating economic synergies. Once people are tied economically together, experience has shown they then want to protect that, and then they're very unwilling to disrupt it, and they then become more and more cohesive in many ways, including at the level of creating collective regional armies to protect themselves. And then eventually these can all become units in for instance, a federated international standing army, and the nations can come together and create a world parliament and so on. So I actually think it's a very sensible approach, Rob, to take.
Shahla asks, a major reason we are not making progress in the understanding of the interconnectedness and hence the establishment of a real world federation is lack of trust among nations. Currently, all nations focus on self-interest. How do you propose to increase trust among nations?
Right. So this requires education, and this is one of the reasons I do what I do. This comes back to the level of principle. I do believe it is possible to persuade nations that it is in their own self-interest as nations to take this course of action, which is to cede a certain amount of sovereignty and decision-making to a global institution. The example and the principle that they need to understand and that we need to help them understand as individuals by educating first the public, I think. So if you start by educating the public on the principle of the advantage of the part can only be assured by assuring the advantage of the whole. Once the public is educated and consciousness is raised, they will either then hold the feet of their leaders to the fire, or they will elect the kinds of leaders that inculcate, as the Guardian says, within them the kind of responsibility necessary to get ourselves to this next stage. Here's the example that I use and that I talk about in Collective Security Within Reach. I alluded to the European coal and steel community that was established in the aftermath of the Second World War. This is a truly amazing, powerful model that we can use in talking to individuals, to institutions, to government officials, to anyone. These 6 nations had debates in their parliaments that went along these lines. They said, wait a minute, our most important resource is coal and steel. It's sort of the equivalent of nations having oil and gas today, say Saudi Arabia and its oil wells. Can you imagine Saudi Arabia ceding control of its oil wells to some supranational organization? So they had the same issue in Europe. Moreover, the supranational organization was going to be made up of people who were not in this instance elected by the peoples of that country. This organization had the power to impose a quota system. It also had the power to impose penalties on any individual corporation or government that failed to abide by its rulings, using the courts of those countries, even though it was not elected by the people. So now you can imagine the levels at which distrust existed and the sense of incredulity. The parliamentarians in their debate said, wait a minute, we're proposing to cede the most important area of our economic sector to a body that is not elected by our people, that bypasses our parliament, that uses our courts to enforce its decisions against us, including penalties, and that's totally independent. Are we crazy? And yet 6 nations concluded that it was in their national interest to pool these resources in exactly this manner, because in the long run it would redound to their national interest to do this, as opposed to hold on to their resources, to assert the control that they had to the extent they had it, and to try to go it alone. In other words, they were convinced that acting together and giving up something to act together collaboratively was better for them than going it alone. These are the kinds of examples that we need to get smart about using to convince people and peoples and nations that it is in their national self-interest. The reason that we continue to have this distrust is that the level of conversation and discourse is still down in the dust. We need to elevate it by raising consciousness and awareness of not just what is possible and visionary, but what has been done very successfully in the very recent historical past.
Thanks. Another question, Paul asks about the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression of the 1930s and how marvelous it was for creating both recovery of natural resources in the United States, but also a kind of national service effort, and wonders whether a planetary recovery corps where thousands of young people from each continent could receive an education while being trained to serve in tree planting and agroforestry might not have a similar kind of impact.
Sounds like a wonderful idea. You see, we need more of these kinds of very creative ideas. that are based on principles of collaboration, connectedness, interdependence. And so I would highly suggest, Paul, if you can, put forward this suggestion and start talking about it at your local United Nations Association events, get involved with the World Federalists, get involved at different levels and start injecting these ideas into conversation at as many different levels as you can. If you have a blog, start blogging about it. This is I love this idea. I had not thought of it. I have not heard of it, but why not? It's another model that worked very well in this country. Why not try to replicate it at a global level? So thank you for that.
Ramin asks a rather interesting question here. He says the idea of world government is currently being pushed by several sources, some of them having nothing to do with world peace. How do we separate ourselves from these other groups when we talk to people about world government?
Very good. So the devil's always in the details and in the motives. It reminds me of a statement that Abdu'l-Baha says about fire. He says, fire is a wonderful tool, but that's all it is. It's a tool, and it can either be used for good or ill. And he gives the analogy of the village in which fire is used to heat food, to give warmth, to create light. He says, now if somebody takes that fire, misuses it, and happens to set all the huts in the village ablaze, people might say, ooh, look, fire is bad. We should do away with fire. To me, this is similar in the sense that, yes, people have different motives, and they're going to use or misuse the idea of world government for laudable purposes, to uplift humanity, or to achieve their own cynical ends. The devil is in the details. World government, again, as described by the Baha'i writings, is very different. In it, all voices are represented. For instance, with respect to the World Parliament, we're told that all the peoples in every country, no matter what their religious, ethnic, racial, whatever backgrounds, are going to have a vote in electing the members of the International Parliament. So think about the Parliament at the European level. That's also evolved. It started off by being the nation states of the European Union that decided who the members of Parliament were, and then they went to direct elections. So the people of the European Union now get to elect the members of the European Parliament. Again, this is a laboratory in which they're experimenting with different modes of doing this, and we can learn a lot about what we might do at a global level. A lot of the other alternative systems of world government currently advocated vest power in a certain group of people, often people from a certain background or certain religion. Power is centralized. There is no unity in diversity. We talked about the various conditions that are going to be necessary for a Baha'i system to flourish. There are many safeguards in place, starting with the mode of election. And so we need to get into details with people. But I agree, if you just say world government, people are going to get scared. So we need to start unpacking it. We need to familiarize ourselves with the details. We need to understand the difference in the details between what Baha'u'llah is advocating and between what these other systems are. It means that we also need to familiarize ourselves with what the other current systems of world government being advocated are, so that we can distinguish the details as we have conversations with friends and colleagues.
We are getting low on time, and we've got a few more questions, but perhaps we can answer them quickly. One person asks, what is the major argument of the people who vehemently oppose a world government, and how can we answer them?
Well, the major argument that I've come across, and others may have come across others, is that people's mind immediately goes to somebody in some far-off place, some central authority, taking over power and doing really bad things to us. And this is why I love to use the example of the American experience, because we in America, people in Rhode Island are not afraid that the central government is suddenly going to invade their territory and impose horrible rules. Why? Because the system involves everybody being involved. We all vote for members of Congress. It's not some group somewhere, some group of dictators that has taken over and that is now going to impose unpalatable laws on us, that is going to oppress us, that is going to come in with armies and decimate us and rape our women and take our crops. It's a system in which we are all an integral part. Virginia does not worry about Maryland overrunning it. Maryland does not worry about the central government overrunning it. Texas doesn't worry about it. We are all part of a combined system in which certain powers reside in the centralized organizations and many powers continue to reside at the local, regional level and at the state level. So these are, again, achieving this kind of clarity I've found in using this example of the United States as a model of federation tends to take this fear out of people who, as I say, immediately think world dictators or world dictatorship, what a horrible thing.
I have one more question here. One person says, well, Texas does worry about these things, haha. But anyway, beside that comment, Shahlos has a very interesting point here. A good question. Seems powerful nations are using the right to protect for bombing other nations than their own, including civilians. Isn't this discouraging? Doesn't it lead us to think that even if world nations unanimously agree on a principle, some nations would interpret it as they see fit for their own self-interest?
Okay. Yes, which is why I started off by saying we have now achieved consensus around the principle, but it doesn't mean that we're there. It's going to take a long while for this principle to be applied in the manner in which it was intended. The second thing is that one principle is not going to do the trick. We need to come up with a set of principles upon which we achieve consensus and which we apply uncompromisingly. If you look at the other principles that I shared in the slide and that are gleaned from the Baha'i writings, you'll see that if those principles are agreed upon in tandem, and the principles, again, remember, are just the tools. They're the tools that have to be applied to building the blueprint. We cannot separate things from each other. People have a tendency to say, well, let's look at this one thing. Baha'u'llah has brought a package deal. This World Federation consists of two things. One are the institutions, the blueprint that we unpacked in great detail, and the second are the foundational principles. You can't take one principle and say, but look, if we take this principle and apply it in a context that is not the design that Baha'u'llah advocated and that does not include the other tools, absolutely they're going to be misused. We need to be advancing on all fronts simultaneously. In other words, we need to start now to create global collective decision-making institutions along the lines advocated by Baha'u'llah, and we need to start achieving consensus around the principles. The reason I brought up R2P wasn't to say, oh, look at R2P, how wonderful it is in and of itself. It was to negate the argument of the skeptic who says that it is impossible in this day and age with so many countries to even achieve consensus around a principle. We've done it. We did it in 5 years. We did it with one principle. We can do it with 7 or 8. We can do it easily. If we start today, probably within a decade, we can have it done. If we leave it because we say it's not possible and start 10 years from 20 years from now, we're just going to suffer a lot more, and we're still going to have to start then. So why not start now, put aside the skepticism, agree on the principles, but we also have to create the institutions. This is somewhat similar to a cancer patient who comes to a doctor and gets medication, chemotherapeutic medication that consists of a cocktail of medicines, but then tries to say, well, wait a minute, what about this one part of the cocktail? If I apply this alone, if I just take this one remedy, then I still have all these other problems. The truth is that the chemotherapy will not tackle the cancer unless the patient is willing to take the entire cocktail of the various remedies that make up the chemotherapy treatment. This reminds me of something that the guardian of the Baha'i Faith said many years ago. He said that the day would come when the statesmen of the world would, despite the best intentions and despite conceiving of the most elaborate plans, find themselves completely impotent to solve the problems that they confront. In my humble opinion, we are fast approaching, if not already arrived at the day when that has happened. We find today's global leaders saying that they do not know what the solution is to problems like the global financial crisis. That was actually the first time that we heard world leaders say, gee, we're going to try something. We're not sure it's going to work, but we're going to give it a try. And the other thing we do know is that we do need to act collectively, that it's too dangerous to tackle this alone. With climate change, we're seeing the same thing. Scientists are telling us what we need to do, but the question is there going to be enough political will to get it done? And again, various leaders are coming up with solutions, but they're not sure that the solutions they come up with are going to effectively tackle global warming in the short run. So it is time really for us to embrace Baha'u'llah's divine program, to implement all of its elements, including the institutions that need to be built and the application of the principles that he has articulated in his writings, and take it as a package deal. It's really getting to the point where it's all or nothing, nothing short of a total embrace of Baha'u'llah's vision and divine program will help humanity get on the course towards its maturity, its collective maturity, and bring about its long-awaited unity and peace.
Well, thank you very much, Sovaida. I think everyone was intrigued and fascinated by your presentation today, which really covered a lot more ground than I was aware we could cover. And I'm really delighted that you were available. Thank you so much for offering us this web talk. I just want to mention our remaining web talks so that people are aware of them. We have 2 of them coming up very shortly. Stephen Freiberg will be speaking about science and religion, our 11th web talk on Sunday, November 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can see 2 p.m. is our standard time for holding this if we have no other conflicts. And then on December 6th, our last web talk of 2015, Michael Penn will be speaking about the nature of the human mind, a Baha'i perspective. So we have 2 really fascinating talks coming up, and we will be announcing our 2016 lineup, at least part of it, fairly soon, once we have at least part of it ready. We are still open for suggestions. If you have any, send them to us. You can see right here, if you go to http://wilmetteinstitute.org, you will be able to reach us that way, or you can call our toll-free number. Also, this particular web talk will be at our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/Wilmette Institute. And I have listed here our upcoming courses in November, starting on the 1st of November, Abdu'l-Baha's Visit to North America, How It Teaches and Inspires Us. This is a revisit of the course we offered in 2012, but with some additional material. The Baha'i calendar course, we've offered it 3 times, and it is filled each time. It's offered again starting on the 5th of November, and if you haven't taken it, it will be a great chance to find out more about the twin holy days. We will be particularly talking about them. Exploring the New Testament starts on the 10th, and that will give you a chance to review the entire Gospels and the letters, the epistles of Paul, various other letters that make up the New Testament. Century of Light, the document commissioned by the Universal House of Justice about the 20th century. We'll start reviewing that on the 15th. And then Science, Religion, and the Baha'i Faith on the 20th. Steve Freiberg's web talk, of course, will be right before then, so it'll give you a chance to get a taste of that particular course. We again thank everybody for participating today, and we look forward to see you in future Web Talks. Thank you.